Good afternoon and good evening, everybody, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Clayton Sinyai, and I'm the Executive Director of the Catholic Labor Network. Welcome to our webinar this evening. Our topic being farm workers and food justice. As many of you who will know who have participated in our webinars before, the Catholic Labor Network is a national organization that brings together Catholic union activists with Catholic clergy, religious, and lay social justice advocates who share a passion for worker justice and for Catholic social teaching on labor and work. Modern Catholic social teaching begins with the encyclical Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII, issued 130 years ago. And that document taught that workers first have a right to organize and form unions in order to improve their conditions. And second, that every worker deserves a living wage. In the United States, there have been few groups of workers who have been excluded from enjoying those rights more than farm workers. Farm work in the United States today is typically done by immigrant workers for very low wages. These men and women work long hours and frequently are found not to earn sufficient salary to allow them to eat the fruits and vegetables that they pick for the rest of us. And that's our topic for tonight. Now, the Catholic Labor Network is the National Farm Workers Ministry, which is an interfaith organization of activists from various Christian traditions who support and accompany farm workers in their struggles, providing solidarity with farm worker organizations and unions. And our speaker for tonight is Julie Taylor, our National Farm Workers Ministry Executive Director. And with that, I will give her the floor for farm workers and food justice.
Clayton, it's great to be with you and all the folks tonight. We're glad to be partnering with the Catholic Labor Network and appreciate the opportunity just to raise awareness about farm workers and food justice, and really appreciate the background that the Catholic Church has in worker rights and their solidarity with farm worker rights among that. Like the Catholic Labor Network, we're a ministry whose mission is to educate, equip, and mobilize people of faith and conscience in the farm worker movement. We've been doing that for over 50 years, and we'd like to be working ourselves out of a job. But at this point, we're dedicated to staying in it until that's a victory that can be won. And so I want to go through just some basic information about farm workers tonight, some basic information about food insecurity, to talk about food justice and some of the ways that farm workers are literally combating that. So I'm going to run through some information and then get to a point where can ask some questions, and but just know I'm kind of hitting the highlights tonight as we spend this time together. So who are farm workers? They're the men and women who are the backbone of this $200+ billion agricultural industry. Their labor benefits each of us every day. Because we all eat, they literally feed us. They're between 1.5 to 2 million. The numbers seem to fluctuate because it's really hard to do an exact count, but 1.5 to 2 million men, women, and children that literally plant, pack, pick our fruits and vegetables and work in our nurseries and dairies and feedlots. The vast majority are Latino. Over 70% are immigrants themselves, and over 50% of those are undocumented individuals in our country, which creates some difficulties in how things work. So just to talk a little bit about the basics of food security, the USDA has a really simple definition. It's access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life. Food insecurity is very simply the opposite of that. The people who spend their days picking our fruits and vegetables struggle to feed their own families. Numerous studies across the United States have documented staggering rates of hunger and food insecurity that plague farm workers and seasonal workers. One study of farm workers in Georgia found that 63% of migrant and seasonal workers who were surveyed struggled to feed themselves and their families. Farm workers often face countless barriers when trying to get food, including low wages, poor or non-existent public transportation, and a lack of culturally appropriate food. In 2017, there was a study of 200 migrant farm workers in North Carolina camps so that we could better understand the transportation barriers and how that affected their access to food. So some of the findings you see on the screen: 91% obtained most of their food from superstores like Walmart. The remaining 9% said they shopped at supermarkets like Food Lion, a pretty popular grocery store here in our state. 87% said that they relied on someone else to drive them to the store. They didn't have their own transportation. They also reported turning to alternative food sources. So for those of us who are in faith communities, I find it interesting that almost 20% relied on a church or a food pantry in the community. Almost 20% ate food grown in a household or a camp garden. And 17.5%, almost 20% relied on food that was given to them by their employer. So what's the nature of how the food contributes to their health? One of the pillars of food justice is utilization. So it's the sort of the biology of what food does for us. The human body takes food and converts it into energy. Oxfam estimates that a farm worker burns in one day the same amount of calories as a marathon runner. So struggling with a lack of food really impacts their capacity as people. So two studies, one in California and one in Michigan, demonstrated high rates of chronic health conditions related to poor nutrition. We're not unfamiliar with these, but high cholesterol, high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, things like that. To put it simply, the people deserving of dignity and respect, as people of deserving dignity and respect, farm workers should have accessible, safe, healthy, and culturally appropriate food. And they must be able to eat food that gives them adequate strength and health so they can pick and process food, because they're an essential part of the agricultural supply chain. While these challenges are not altogether new, they have been exposed and exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. As farm workers have continued to work in the fields, dairies, nurseries, and meatpacking plants despite high levels of COVID transmission, they also wait in growing food lines, strategically ration groceries, and receive little to no governmental support because of their immigration status. In just a second, I'm going to play a video that we produced this year to illustrate that. But for us, agricultural workers face environmental, political, economic, and structural barriers that prevent them from being able to sustainably feed their families. In the US, farm workers uphold the agricultural industry while simultaneously being 400 times more likely to experience food insecurity than the general public. They work long, arduous hours under punishing conditions and are literally unable to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Let's watch this video, help us understand that a little bit better.
Every single one of us depend on farm workers every single day. And yet most people never even think about it. Don't even know who farm workers are. It's completely out of their range of thought.
Sabe uno muy cansado del trabajo, que es muy pesado trabajar en el campo. Llega uno cansadísimo y hacer de comerles a los hijos. Tiene uno que cocinar y trabajar y hacer todo a la vez.
Our food system is very extractive, and we tend to treat the soil, the workers, the animals that are part of that food production system as expendable. And they're, for that same reason, very exploited. And so food justice means that none of those parts of the food system are exploited, but that they are allowed to work in a safe and just environment.
Siempre se ha hecho una contradicción de que, o sea, supuestamente los trabajadores de agrícolas son los que tienen más acceso a la comida y es más difícil. Se la pasan trabajando y trabajando y pues no tienen tiempo para ir a agarrar su comida. Se les hace muy difícil el transporte a veces. Para encontrar comida fresca también no cosechan, no recogen esos productos frescos.
Food justice is the idea that all the food that we consume, that everything that comes to our tables goes through a process where the people who procure our food are well taken care of, where the animals that provide that food are also well taken care of, where the trade agreements that bring that food to our tables are respectful of the people who produce that food and the workers who were involved in that food procurement, that all human rights are respected and that it doesn't displace any other people, that it respects all those involved, so that when it comes to our table, we can be sure that no humans, animals, or plants were unnecessarily harmed in the production of that food.
El tener auto es una desventaja porque a veces no tenemos quien nos lleve, a veces nos dicen no, en tal hora puedo, a veces pueden, a veces no. Y a veces si no pueden tenemos que buscar a otra persona que nos lleva. Tenemos que pagar el raite también. Tenemos que comprar todo para que uno ya no salga más, porque imagínense andar pagando también raite cada salida, a veces. La lenteja no lo puedo hacer. Sí, yo soy diabética, digo, y tengo que tener cuidado también al cocinar, porque si no, me rebano un dedo. Porque por ver así lo comíamos así, porque como no había para salchicha ni para nada, ni para otra cosa, lo comíamos nada más así, solito. Nada de su esposa allá en la...
If the only food that is accessible to you is food that is highly processed, that has been robbed of its nutritional value, you're more likely to develop some long-term conditions. And at least here in Florida, the issues that we have seen among workers is a predisposition to diabetes, high, a lot of them already come with high glucose levels from they have high blood pressure, they are dehydrated. And just, the accumulation of all those health factors just puts them at a greater risk.
A través de esto también hay mucha convivencia entre la comunidad porque todos colaboran y se hace un grupo grande para ayudar a repartir la comida y es bueno.
Yo soy campesina de nacimiento. Crecimos pescando fresa, pescando maíz, chile, jitomate, todo lo que se daba en el campo, nosotros lo hacíamos desde pequeñas. Ahora, por ejemplo, cuando la gente viene y me dice, mira, sabes que no tengo, pero nada en el refrigerador y que la organización puede ayudarle con eso, y la gente se va tan agradecida que, wow, realmente es una bendición para nosotros poder tener ese papel dentro de la comunidad y dentro de la organización.
Yo me gusta hacer enchiladas o tamales, porque yo soy de San Luis. Yo pues a veces pues no lo hago porque no me alcanza el tiempo. Y a veces corre uno para comprar comida más rápida, que pues no viene siendo tan buena, que porque para comer, qué rápido, pues que una pizza. Pues eso no es nutritivo para los niños ni para uno tampoco.
Que tengan buen día.
Gracias. Igualmente, gracias.
Como donde yo vivo me agarra como a 35 minutos para ir a Walmart. Y a veces por aquí no encuentra uno lo que busca para cocinar algo fresco.
La comida no es algo que la gente se tiene, en mi opinión, que ganar. La comida se le debería de dar a todo ser humano. Es el derecho de existir. Y que alguien lo manipule para obtener un beneficio propio o para crear esas diferencias sociales, a mí de verdad que me parece desastroso, por no decir otras palabras.
Food sovereignty means giving control back to the people. Give control back to the communities, absolutely. And they come here with knowledge, and sometimes indigenous and ancestral knowledge.
Also, part of food sovereignty is that what you're growing is something that is important to you, that is part of your cultural tradition, that is the food that you know from home, from when you were growing up, and not something that was processed and then boxed and canned or put through a grinder and baked very easy for you, but it means something that means something to you, to your family history, something that you smell and it reminds you of home.
Perdón, mami.
Te digo, Ana, que quisiera hacer jirafa ahorita.
No, para alcanzar las de arriba.
Alcanzar las de arriba están hermosas.
Estas son bien flexibles las martillas.
Sí, está bien, son bien nerviosas. Se rompen un poquito.
¿Esto hará daño?
No hace daño, pero es para quitarle más la resina.
Ya, es una planta del sureste de México. Se acostumbra allá por Veracruz, toda la que era península
por
de México.
Tabasco,
Yucatán. Sí. Es la espinaca de árbol, le dicen a alguna gente. Te la llevas para que la siembres.
Llévatela para que la tengas.
Ay, sí, cierto, me la llevo. Mira, vamos a
Lo
deshojarla.
hizo el propósito.
Ay,
Pues
sí,
no te la llevo. Pero esa así nace, así.
sí, ponemos en tamalitos. Ponemos a poner a hervir el agua y la sumergimos la hoja y la apagas. La dejas, la sacas hasta que el agua ya está fría, la exprimes bien y se pica, bien picadita. Y ya se le revuelve pues a la masa para hacer los tamalitos. Le puedes poner un poquito de frijoles chiquito y le puedes poner la mantequita y ya los envuelves y salen muy ricos.
Ya que la encontré, la sigo cocinando con huevo. Te digo, y es muy nutritivo. Y aparte de eso, te ayuda con la diabetes, limpieza de riñones, todo eso. Son muchas propiedades que tiene.
De verdad que me gustaría venir a hacer un día para que ustedes lo probaran.
Ah, sí. Sería buenísimo que nos enseñen.
Los tamalitos. Oh, de verdad. Los tamalitos. Sí, para que ustedes lo prueben.
Nomás díganos qué sábado puede y nos organizamos para
hace años que no hacemos, deje practicar.
Muy bueno porque pues deja uno de extrañar la comida de allá. Te digo, la deja uno de extrañar. Un sábado que vengamos voy a traer huevitos. Ah, perfecto, ya. Llevo el entonces le quito esto.
Esto sí nada más, esto, mira, pero quita mucha grasa.
Esto hará daño,
No. Yo creo que hay dos tipos, hay una que gana con que tiene mucha pelusa.
Sorry. So the video helps illustrate the connection that people have between their food and the land and their health, all of that. Food justice, sort of beyond food security, as we talk about food justice, we're talking about holistic and structural view of the food system that sees healthy food as a human right and addresses structural barriers to that. Food justice efforts, generally led by Indigenous peoples and people of color, work not only for access to food, but for an end to the structural inequities that lead to unequal outcomes. Reina Lopez, leader of Cocoon in Oregon, a farm worker group in Oregon, farm worker union in Oregon, says consumers need to ask that question. Where did my food come from? How are the people treated that were picking these fruits and vegetables? This is food justice. Many of us have heard about food deserts or areas with poor access to healthy food. This takes us a little deeper from food security to looking at the issues behind food justice. Typically, if the food desert maps highlight the locations of grocery stores and transit lines, and initiatives that come out of these projects might include increasing transit access in a given area or establishing pop-up markets in a food desert. In contrast, the term food apartheid is used to highlight the racially discriminatory political structures that in the past and present impact food access and control. Food apartheid looks at the whole food system and takes into account income, race, and geography. It encompasses the social and racial inequalities that are at play in our food system. It recognizes that the systems in place are what make it difficult for people living in low-income areas to access fresh, healthy food. The fight to end food apartheid is community-driven, and efforts burgeon from local cries to redistribute power and dismantle oppressive political and economic structures which disempower communities of color. So what does food justice look like for farm workers? Jeannie Economos of the Farm Worker Association in Florida longtime organizer with them, says justice is not just about wages. It's not just about working conditions. It means giving control to the people, giving a voice to the people, listening to them, and not just listening to them. They need to be part of the decision-making. A quote by Leah Cohen of the Agricultural Justice Project, also based in Florida, says, typically when you're talking about justice, there's a few who are advantaged in whatever system you're talking about, and there are many who are disadvantaged by that system. So justice is about changing those systemic factors that create that kind of disparity. It's a staggering statistic that the people who feed us are less likely to be able to feed themselves. Those systems create that insecurity and those disparities with regards to food insecurity. And so food justice is about eliminating those disparities. Food sovereignty, just briefly moving from food security to food justice to food sovereignty. It's the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their rights to define their own food and agriculture systems. Neza talked about this in the video. Food sovereignty means solidarity, not competition, and building a fairer world from the bottom up. Food is also political. The production of and access to and distribution of food are essential for our society to function and control our food. Function and control of our food system confers power. So let's look at some self-directed solutions in regards to food justice for farm workers. Naturally, and this I know is something that the Catholic Labor Network is working on all the time, support unions, for us specifically farm worker unions and organizations that are helping farm workers to have their own voices heard. Worker rights are human rights. Farm worker rights are human rights. Farm workers deserve the same protections as all the other workers. So let's talk about some of the other ways that farm workers have self-directed opportunities. One is through food certification programs. The National Farm Worker Ministry currently partners with 4 food certification programs. 3 of them have food labels. And so you'll see in the next few slides some of the labels that you can literally look for in your local grocery store. And if you don't see them, you can ask your store manager about them. Each of these organizations is independent of the National Farm Worker Ministry and of each other, but they all serve a similar purpose to bring together growers, farm workers, packers, distributors, retailers, and consumers to transform agriculture at various levels, improve the lives and working conditions of farm workers. The first one we highlight is the Agricultural Justice Project. And so they're a comprehensive approach to food certification. They have a fair farm certification program, a fair company certification program, and a fair farm and company food certification program. So all the companies have to adhere to a set of standards, and then they're monitored by people that are part of the Agricultural Justice Project. Another food certification program that we have supported for a long time is the Equitable Food Initiative. The Equitable Food Initiative, or EFI that we call it for short, focuses on worker involvement and active collaboration among all the stakeholders, the major food buyers, the growers, the farm worker groups, and consumer advocates. They have a special emphasis on food safety. Another food certification program is the Fair Food Program. This one is sponsored by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. It is a worker-driven, socially responsible model. The Fair Food Program is a unique partnership among farmers, farm workers, and retail food companies that ensures humane wages and working conditions for the workers who pick fruits and vegetables on participating farms. It harnesses the power of consumer demand to give farm workers a voice in the decisions that affect their lives and to eliminate long-standing abuses that have plagued agriculture for generations. A newer food certification program that actually collaborated with the Fair Food Program of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers is the Milk with Dignity program. This is specifically in Vermont, although I understand they're expanding to Maine, Massachusetts. But participating farms in the Milk with Dignity program are paid a premium to support and reward compliance with the code. They have a Milk with Dignity code of conduct that includes labor standards and worker treatment. So these are food certification programs. The Equitable Food Initiative is primarily on the West Coast, and you can see it most at Whole Foods and Costco. The Fair Food Program, you'll see primarily on the East Coast. You'll see that at Whole Foods, but also at Walmart. And the Fair Food Program has worked amongst the large major fast food companies, specifically in relation to the tomatoes that they purchase. So some self-directed food justice programs that farm workers sponsor or participate in are community gardens that help to educate the whole community, but also give farm workers an opportunity to raise their own food in a community setting, not necessarily on the farms where they already work. And they do it in partnership with people from the community. Food cooperatives out on the West Coast, Familias Unidas por la Justicia, a small farm worker union in Washington State, actually owns a food cooperative, and farm workers work there and are able to control the whole process at that particular berry farm. And then not strictly related to farm workers, but closer to small farms and connecting the field to the table, or community supported agricultural programs. These are ways in which all of us have closer control of our own food systems. So some of the other ways that we can support farm workers in food justice is to show up for farm workers and support their campaigns. National Farm Worker Ministry has been supporting for a number of years now a boycott of Wendy's that has been sponsored by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Wendy's is the last of the major fast food companies who has held out from signing into the Fair Food Program, but Taco Bell, McDonald's, Burger King, Chipotle, Subway are all part of the Fair Food Program already for all the tomatoes that they serve there. Just as a point of reference, Immokalee is a small town in Florida, and in that community, most of the tomatoes for all the fast food companies are grown. So they have been working on these companies for a number of years. And there are other opportunities to support farm workers. Some issues to think about in relation to food justice: farm workers are closest to the ground, literally. So what happens to them, what happens in the fields happens to them. So to help and support them, all the farm worker partners have worked on and longed for a comprehensive immigration reform package to provide a pathway to citizenship or immigration status for not only the farm workers in this country that are undocumented, but their families as well. Ending the fear and threat of deportation would go a long way in helping farm workers thrive in our country. We have been part of an effort to seek national heat stress regulations in this country. At this point, California is the only state that has those on a full-time basis. Some of the other states, I think Washington State and a couple others, have passed sort of emergency heat stress standards given the extreme heats that they experienced, especially earlier in the summer. But there is a piece of legislation in Congress called the Ascension, Valdevia Heat Illness and Fatality Prevention Act that would ensure workers have access to water, rest, and shade all around the country. And we would love to see this, this happen. It would literally save farm workers' lives. There are food justice, there are community solutions on food justice, ways in which communities can help. And just to share a few of those, gleaning, there are organizations, some food bank sponsor gleanings, but I know there's an organization called the Society of St. Andrew based in Virginia, but with offices around the country that sponsors volunteer gleaning events where food that's left in the field after harvest is picked by volunteers and shared with food banks, soup kitchens, and in communities. Supporting food banks, food pantries, supporting food drives, and other sorts of things are emergency steps. And we really advocate for long-term solutions, but in light of the fact that farm workers experience hunger, we also encourage and support folks doing what they can do in their communities to help that. We remind people that when you shop and eat, remember farm workers. Some of the ways you can do that is if you understand the food production chain, how food literally goes from the farm and to our table. There's a path, and one of the things to know about that is that when you buy things that are processed or prepared for you, farm worker actually gets a much smaller share of that than of what you buy that is fresh, that comes to be sold in the produce section of your grocery store, farmer's market, or supermarket. So those are some ways that we can support farm workers in community efforts, even while we take the time to call our legislators and do some of those things. But that's a lot. I've sort of shared a lot of information about food and food justice and farm workers and the way in which they're seeking to approach that. And so I want to pause at this point to see if there are questions or comments that folks want to make in relation to some of the things that have been shared.
Feel free to speak up with any questions you have or drop them in the chat. Julie, you can stop sharing your screen and it'll be easier for us to see if people are raising their hands. But I see Ian Mitchell with a question. Ian, you're up.
Thank you very much, Clayton. Julie, thank you for an excellent presentation on very important issues. I work with the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and we are involved in supporting a number of the farm work organizations, like you mentioned this evening. I just I think, I can't remember whether you mentioned this, but I think it is interesting that the fact that farm workers are left out of, like domestic workers, are left out of many national labor protections is a direct vestige of and memory of racism and slavery in the country. That it was part of the legacy of slavery, that domestic workers and farm workers were by design not given protection under labor law. So many organizations are making progress on state level legislation, like you mentioned. I'm curious whether there's hope for national labor protection for farm workers and domestic workers, if you're aware of that. But mainly just wanted to mention that this was by design. And so this work that you're mentioning of solidarity and support for the farm workers is so important. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And you're absolutely right. It's by design. So my first answer to what you just said is, you know, as people of faith, there's always hope, right? We don't give up. the stories of our faith are stories of David and Goliath and things like that. So we always have hope. I wish I could say that there is a piece of legislation that would go through Congress right now and right all of these wrongs. There have been attempts over the last few years, especially to try to change at least aspects of some of those labor laws. There was a bill called Fairness for Farm Worker Act, which basically would provide for all farm workers. And I don't think most people realize, but under federal legislation, farm workers are not required to receive overtime for their work. That ends up becoming to some degree a state matter, and but it's also really hard to monitor and enforce. But I know, and somebody on the call may want to talk about that. Virginia's been trying to work on that. I'm part of a coalition in Massachusetts that actually thinks they might succeed in making that a state, making that a state law. California has it, of course, but it's a struggle. So what you'd really love to have is a federal piece of legislation that would make that true across the board. I think we support that, but at the same time, we'll fight the state battles with our supporters in different states because those are steps in that direction. And it's just challenging in different states. Fairness for Farm Worker is one of the sort of coined phrases. There was a federal piece of legislation that was introduced 2 Congresses ago and then reintroduced, but it often is not bipartisan when it's introduced. So the hope of getting it passed we have a contentious situation anyway, but the hope of getting it passed is flagging. We'll say it's flagging. I won't give it up, but it's flagging. I actually had and still have some hope that we will achieve a national heat stress regulation. Would love to have that happen. And I've been part of a group of people, a coalition of people, farm workers on it, but also lots of folks in other professions as well, working on national heat stress regulations. To me, it feels more like a no-brainer and less of a political issue. But I think, we still struggle with monitoring the number of people that can oversee a program and then actually press for the once somebody has been found to not be instituting heat stress regulations, the whole assessing a fee to them and getting that paid and all of that, that's troublesome in labor laws across the board, unfortunately. So even more so with farm workers because they're so marginalized. But I am hopeful that we might be able to pass a heat stress regulation before the end of this Congress. I think we'll just about have to, because once the elections occur again, it can shift the balance of power of people who are interested in pushing that forward versus people they're more interested in protecting sort of corporations and stuff like that from having to fulfill things. But I was hopeful about that. I was hopeful about some workers' regulations, especially around COVID. But what we're finding, certainly here in North Carolina, is, and I think this was true, this is what we heard on a call recently in Virginia, was that people really, that there was a possibility of saying, yes, we want to provide protective equipment and, these kinds of things, but how do you pay for them? So the sticking point becomes, where do you pull that money from? So I think the people, I'm not all up in lots of policy, but I think people that do policy, their capacity to be creative about how they can help folks find money to do that in a budget where nobody wants to add to it is commendable. but they're doing it. And I think that has gotten traction in a number of states, but not enough across every state. And of course, immigration has been, one of these really challenging pieces. Of course, that's not part of labor law specifically, although the H-2A regulations around guest workers fall under that. But so I'm not sure what to tell you about that, Ian. I still have hopes, and in a lot of ways, we've sort of followed in the path of California. A lot of times they've had better labor laws for farm workers than most of the other states. So, they put some things out like the overtime bill. More people have been willing to look at how it got phased in and take that on, and in some places have chosen a shorter phase-in period. So that's encouraging that we could actually make some traction on that. But yeah, it's a struggle. I'm in North Carolina. It's a right to work state. So part of the struggle here is just such a strong it's prevalent in a lot of places, but a strong anti-union sort of perspective about things. So we're fighting a battle here on just the right to freedom of association and the way in which a farm labor union could operate in this state. The state has regulated against it, and it's gone to court and been thrown back. So so it's interesting. We're actually doing more organizing people of faith around corporations that could have some influence on that at this point. But we're yet to see how far that's going to get us, right? We're in the middle of it at this point.
Well, Julie, a couple of people have offered questions in the chat.
Okay.
One is about whether farm workers have been receiving their immunization shots or opportunities to get the COVID vaccine.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky because there's just been this sort of prevalent fear that they'll be monitored, counted. The fear of deportation has been really strong. There were some initial efforts here in North Carolina to do some vaccination clinics, and there were some folks from National Guard, I think, that came to help support that. And the farm workers didn't want to come because they represented the government, and they were afraid that that they would be targeted for deportation. And just a lot of a lot of misinformation about that has made a set of people really frightened. But people already frightened by the fact that they're undocumented, or it's a real struggle with them. I will say that number-wise, it's a little tricky. Oregon and Washington State, and I think California have all done studies about the impact of COVID on farm workers there, so that they can, try to push forward for vaccines and stuff. Almost all of the farm worker partners that we work with have sponsored clinics to try to get the people, because they're a trusted entity, and to get farm workers within their networks to be vaccinated. Here in North Carolina, one of the things I found out early on, because we were talking about visiting farm labor camps, we found out, North Carolina has a mixture of H-2A workers versus undocumented people, a lot of whom come from Florida and other parts to work in the state in the summer. So our numbers swell. So we get about 28,000, 32,000 H-2A workers in the state of North Carolina, and they work under the North Carolina Growers Association. Of those workers this year, I understand about 87% of them were vaccinated. It was just part of the agreement for them. So they were vaccinated when they came, and so a smaller percentage were not vaccinated. But when it came to the remainder of the almost 300,000 workers that we have here in the summer and the fall, the numbers reverse. It's more like 80 to 90% that are not vaccinated, and a smaller percentage that are. And COVID, when I talked to an organizer here in North Carolina, COVID's been rampant at some of the farm worker camps. And to a large degree, unless a farm worker has serious, not just symptoms, but serious outcomes of that, for the most part, they just continue to work. And so they've had sort of this springing up all over. And as far as I know, that's happened in a number of places. The whole effort to keep people physically distanced has been challenging for their living quarters, for their transportation, and even for their working conditions. Just easier for them to work in concert with each other close by in order to load trucks and things like that than to, even though you have this big field, to spread them out. They work faster when they're closer together. So it's an ongoing challenge. I don't have specific numbers across the board. It really varies from place to place. There are growers who invite folks in and do vaccine clinics, some right next to the field. But there's far more that don't. They just don't. And they're not particularly enthusiastic about having some of the mobile health clinics come on their property either. So.
Now, Julie, I share your concern about the heat stress, pushing for this heat stress legislation, partly because I come out of the construction industry and the laborers union, which is the other large group of workers who die regularly of heat stress during the summer months.
Right, postal workers.
Here in Virginia, I know they're working on state level action, or they're developing a regulation. But we have someone from Iowa who was asking how they can get involved in working on promoting heat stress regulations. Do you have any recommendations for?
Sure. I think probably they haven't advertised themselves. We had a sort of an unofficial collective of folks that were working with groups on heat stress, and we're connected. Public Citizen group, I think based in Washington, D.C., has been really a leader on it. But over a period of time, kind of had to let go of a really intensive campaign, but they sort of reinvigorated us not too long ago. But if you want to write me directly in the chat, I'll save the chat notes and I can send you the contact person for that group to put you on their listserv. They will often let us know like the movement of legislation, if there is any, or opportunities to have comments, especially state specific comments, or on occasion when we have the opportunity to actually, try to lobby OSHA or the EPA. So if you, I would be, it's not, I'm hesitant to just share it out just because it's not a particularly open group at this point, because they're, people aren't necessarily maintaining or collecting for it. But I could, if you're really interested in that, I could connect you to it directly. Be glad to.
Okay. We're getting close to the end, but we have two more questions if we can get to them. First, we have someone who would like you to again quickly recap the the certification programs that you mentioned.
So and this is not exhaustive, and there's lots of different viewpoints, but we've been supporting primarily 4 food certification programs. One is the Agricultural Justice Project, and these are all searchable on the web, but Agricultural Justice Project, Leah Cohen leads those in Florida. The second one is the Equitable Food Initiative. That one was literally, we helped to start that with several of the farm worker union leaders. So on the board of directors, it's not farm worker led as far as the president, Peter O'Driscoll, but he has a huge heart for farm workers, and on his board of directors is a representative from the UFW, Cocoon, and Flock, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee in Ohio. The third one is the Fair Food Program, which is sponsored by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Very, very active. It's easy to search for them on the web. And also these are all on our website too. Milk with Dignity is, although Milk with Dignity is not on our website, but it's part of the resources that we have this year on food justice in our Harvest of Justice season. So Milk with Dignity is the third one. They don't do a labeling program. They work directly with the people that, with the dairy farm workers, but dairy farms. So those are the four.
Okay, and the other question was regards the tech sector. A question from someone who's very skeptical of the tech sector as anti-labor and anti-worker, wants to know if anything coming out of the tech sector has been good for agriculture and agriculture workers.
Let's say the last part again.
Has anything good, have you seen any good initiatives coming out from our tech sector, our tech billionaires in terms of supporting farm workers?
No.
I didn't think so. I can add that not with farm workers, but in the area of food service, that some of the companies which are not terribly great with their own workers, companies like Facebook and Google, have insisted on fair labor standards from the vendors who come in and run their cafeterias. So that's the best thing I can think of to say on behalf of the tech sector and agriculture and food workers. But no, not a lot of initiatives out of there.
So, I should qualify that by saying not that I'm aware of. I think we have, I mean, part of the efforts in farm worker advocacy have been around corporations. So, you know, a push with Wendy's and stuff like that. I've been gratified to see somebody like Civil Eats feature us a lot. And I have to say, CNN did a whole series of videos on the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, so in the media industry. But I haven't seen, yeah, there's a lot I haven't seen.
And it's not a tech point, but Ian Mitchell wanted to remind us that Milk with Dignity got off the ground in large part because of the support of Ben and Jerry's.
Right, they did.
So that's at least a nice story to end on.
It is. They went after, Migrant Justice went after Ben and Jerry's, and there was conversation and whatever, and they signed an agreement. But similarly, the Fair Food Program, they went after Taco Bell and got Taco Bell to sign on with them, and you know, McDonald's. There's a series of other so there's some companies that are making some inroads, but I wish I could say everything Taco Bell served is under a Fair Food Program contract. It's not. It's their tomatoes. So it's farm workers are really the most marginalized, and as far as political power or whatever, they don't bring much of that to it. So the incentive for companies to really embrace their issues. We've been working on a campaign for 9 years or so with Reynolds American Tobacco here in North Carolina to, on the face of it, they say, oh yeah, we want everybody to work under good circumstances, but they haven't been willing to do anything in relation to enforcement of that. So it's a continual push with them.
Well, thank you. With that, our hour is up. I want to thank all of you for joining us here today for our discussion of farm workers and food justice. And chances are, if you're interested in the heat standard, for instance, keep an eye on your email box. We'll probably be be doing that. We, the Catholic Labor Network, will probably be reaching out to you with a legislative alert about that and give you a chance to send an email to your legislators about it. All right.
Right.
Have a wonderful evening or afternoon, depending on where you are.
Right. Great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good night.